Mr.
Thanks.
Chair. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on next to the workforce education funding model. In our workforce education system, the funding for this important component of our post-secondary education system formula is driven and derived. Again, the goal is to ensure that funding is objective and equitable across all 67 counties. Tara Goodman, the Bureau Chief for Budget Accountability and Assessment in the Division of Career and Adult Education, is here to present this information. Ms. Goodman, you are recognized. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Chancellor Duckworth sends his regards. He's at the Workforce Summit and wasn't able to attend, but I'm sure you'll be seeing a lot of him during this session. Let me load up this presentation. So I wanted to start off with just a differentiation from the presentation that you just heard from the college system. All of you are aware that we do have a dual delivery system when it comes to our workforce education mission in the state. And these program areas that you see displayed here, we have a system where sometimes the college is providing it, sometimes the district is providing these services, and sometimes both are providing the services because there's sufficient demand and historical precedent for those offerings. But in terms of my presentation today, I'm going to be talking about those resources that are provided to school districts for these programs. So with your permission, I would just like to cover just a base background of information. So we have 57 school districts that receive funds for workforce development activities. The program areas that you see here are those areas that the districts offer. In some cases, the college is the sole provider of these services in the region. For example, in Seminole County, you will not see a workforce development appropriation for Seminole County because the college is the provider for all those services, similar with Duval County. Within this system, though, we have 49 technical career centers or colleges that offer these programs in their regions. We also have some districts that only offer the adult general education components. These program areas are really divided into two categories when we think about them and how we treat them in our funding model that I will discuss in a moment. The career certificate and apprenticeship programs are those technical training programs that provide targeted skills that lead directly to employment for the individuals involved in those programs. So career certificates, a good example of that program is Licensed Practical Nurse. It's the largest program that's offered by the school districts, and that provides specific training for that occupation. The other large technical area that we have is the apprenticeship training programs. And these are really sponsored programs. There is an employer sponsor, and the district partners with that employer sponsor to provide the classroom instruction for these programs. So it truly is the ultimate education industry partnership because it would not exist if there was not employment in a field. You don't have an apprentice unless they are employed in the field. They have the separate category that we have that deals with non-technical training we call adult ed or adult general education programs. These are the programs that lead to literacy. The foundation for any movement in our pathway to progression to higher levels of education is being able to read, write, and possess all of those skills. So we do have individuals in Florida who still do not have those base literacy skills necessary to make that progression. Once they leave the K-12 system, they need an opportunity to acquire those skills. And so we have large adult basic education programs for students whose skills are below 9th grade. We have high school equivalency and adult high school programs that provide these students the opportunity to receive a diploma. In many cases, that diploma is necessary to move into certain career areas, and it's definitely required to move into the Florida college system and state universities. So we are the access point for a lot of students in Florida who need to acquire those base skills necessary to move forward and into gainful employment and to post-secondary education. So that kind of sets the stage programmatically for the workload funding model that I'm going to discuss the various factors for. The primary funding source for school district workforce education is state funds. There are tuition requirements that I will talk about a little bit later, but as you can see from this chart, the vast majority of operating funds that support these programs are provided through the state appropriations process in that workforce development funding category. These programs do have some supplemental funding resources available through federal grants that are also included in the budget category for district workforce education that runs through this committee. The Carl Perkins Career and Technical Education Act. There are post-secondary funds that are provided to these same programs. Not a large amount, it's less than $6 million that are provided from that federal funding source specifically for these types of programs. And then we also have the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, has an adult education and family literacy component, and we have competitively dispersed funds, a lot of which go to school districts for the support of those non-technical training programs. But those are largely supplemental in nature, and they help you enhance and develop your programs, but the main support for the programs is provided through the state appropriation. In terms of where the funds are expended, I pulled the most recent cost report for your review so you could see that a little more than half of the expenditures in these programs, and this includes general fund plus tuition revenue, are spent on apprenticeship, and the largest majority on career certificate and applied technology diploma programs, so the technical training component. The remaining funds are expended on our adult general education component. In terms of the cost that is borne by the student, for the technical training programs in the career certificate area, there is a clock hour based tuition. These are not college credit programs, they are clock hour based, so there have been competency timelines placed in terms of how much training is necessary. Some of them are licensed, some of them are not. For example, LPN is going to be licensed, so it's going to have a regulatory framework for how many hours have to be provided. In other cases, the industry is working with the Department of Education to tell us how many hours are required. Students can individually accelerate. If it turned out that they could complete a course more quickly or they come in with competencies, they may possess an industry certification that can demonstrate some of their skills. They can move into these programs more quickly if they have those. So they can offset the cost of the tuition to them by accelerating. We don't want to reteach something that someone already knows how to do. If someone from the military comes in with specific skills, we're not going to make them take those hours over again in some sort of bureaucratic manner. So our institutions work with them and throughout the framework. But for those students who do need these hours, they are assessed, if they're not exempt, a clock hour based tuition. It's $2.33 per contact hour is the standard rate. Similar to the colleges, they are able to locally increase or decrease this rate by 5%. And if you are a non-resident for tuition purposes, you do have an out-of-state fee. In terms of what this means in terms of outlay, this seems kind of vague. $2.33, that doesn't seem like very much. But when you apply it to an FTE, it's a little more than $2,000 for 900 hours of instruction, which is what our FTE reflects. On the apprenticeship side, students are fee exempt under the statute, so they do not pay any tuition and fees for any of their programs as a result of that exemption. Historically, my understanding is the apprenticeship sponsor is putting resources into this program, and because of this partnership relationship, the student itself is not assessed a tuition. In terms of adult general education, there is a block tuition that is assessed to our adult general education students, but it is not dependent upon the amount of service they receive. If they want to accelerate their learning and enroll for, a lot of hours in a term, 400 hours, they really want to, gain these skills, they can do that, and they pay the same rate as if they enrolled for 20 hours. So it's a standard rate per term that they are assessed. The districts and colleges do have a choice on do they assess $30 per term or $45 per half year, so for 6 months of service. Most tend to do the $30 per term because administratively I think it's a lot easier to work with. And just so that I'll go back to a previous chart, about $44 million in tuition. So when you look at the state appropriation in relation to the tuition collected, again, the vast majority is state funds. In terms of the volume of students that are being served, this chart shows the full-time equivalents in our certificate and apprenticeship programs. You can see the trend lines here. In career certificate, it's fairly stable. You can see a slight dip since 2011-12. Similar to the college programs, I think you will see that when the economy improves, when unemployment starts to drop, people are fully employed, or it's easier for them to find a job. So they may be less likely to enroll in a certificate training program as a result of that. It's not gone down that much over the last few years as the unemployment rate has declined as well, but you do see a decline. The exact opposite occurs with apprenticeship for the very nature of what I said earlier. You have to be employed to be in an apprenticeship program. You're not in an apprenticeship program unless you're employed. So for that reason, you see the exact opposite happening. As the state economy has improved, as the industries that are typically apprenticeable, although we are trying to get more apprenticeable occupations, they tend to be in construction trades in Florida. There's a lot of electricians and plumbing, a lot of core infrastructure areas are apprenticed in the state of Florida. That's where you see a lot of our employer sponsors. And so they have rebounded, as you can see, significantly over the last few years as the economy and those industries have returned. In terms of our adult general education population, this is the FTE for this. We serve a very large head count in this program, but students don't tend to be enrolled for a lot of hours. I think the average hours per year that you will see in these programs is less than 300 on average. You know, you have some students more, some students less. Because once they achieve those skills, you know, they hopefully move on. So we have about 175,000 students generating this 34,000 FTE. It has remained fairly stable. You see a lot of dips and valleys in this one. You haven't seen the decline that you would see with the unemployment rate. It has remained fairly constant over this period of time. So that kind of sets the stage for what I was invited here to talk to you about was how do we use all this information and activity related to these programs to generate a workload-based funding model. Historically, many years ago, we had a different funding model, and for the last 10 years, we've been moving towards the funding model that we are currently using and that this committee has used over the last few years to inform your allocation decisions at both the system level and at the district level. And it is largely driven by where is the need for services, where has the historical need for access for these programs through these institutional arrangements, where has it been needed? So it is largely driven by the FTE that I just discussed. We do have a funding committee that reviews this. It's statutorily noted in our primary funding statute. It is represented varyingly by about 10 to 12 districts. We may gain or lose members as staffing changes at different institutions, but all of the large districts and many small and medium districts are represented. And we meet annually to review the factors in this model. A few years ago, OPAGA was assigned a study by the legislature to review these factors as well, and I'm happy to say that they confirmed that it was an accurate representation of workload, and they had some minor recommendations that the department did adopt. So we have gone through periodic reviews. And the goal of this committee really is to keep the model current, because it's supposed to reflect what's going in our programs, and is this model reflecting the cost to deliver these programs in these institutions? In terms of what elements are included, it's a lot less boxes than the colleges, so hopefully it's a little easier for me to explain. But in terms of how the factors that go into it is that we start with the prior year appropriation, and that's always the comparison point, and I think that's the comparison point for the college. So we run this model and we see where are we in relation with our current appropriation level with what this model demonstrates that the institutions need. The primary driver of this is the instructional hours and FTE that we discussed. For the most part, we use the FTE that is distributed to us and sent to us by the school districts. However, we do apply some moderate caps to them. We don't pay for more than 2,000 hours of apprenticeship OJT time. We don't pay for more than 1,300 hours of instruction in adult general ed. These are standard state policies that we apply. So there can sometimes be a difference between what the institution reported and what we consider to be fundable for this model. In terms of program cost factors, that's one of the big roles of the committee that I discussed. They set these factors. These are the people who operate these programs. We have 3 primary cost factors that are used: low, medium, and high. Those are set out in the statute itself. And so we align our program cost factors with that low, medium, and high methodology. A low-cost program would be something that is just primarily a teacher in a classroom with a minimal amount of supplies. You would tend to see maybe child care fall into that. It's not anything that has very intensive supplies. On the higher end, you might see welding. There's a lot of consumables. There's a lot of things that get used up during the instructional strategies used for that program. A licensed practical nurse would be another example, because there are clinical hours plus low required student to teacher ratios that tend to drive up the average cost for the program. So that committee actually sets a cost for each of our certificate programs, and we have more than 200 that are offered, as well as for the apprenticeship. And the apprenticeship cost always models the certificate cost. If you're an electrician apprentice or an electrician in the career certificate, the classroom hours are going to be weighted the same. The OJT hours are going to be weighted much differently, because while the programs monitor that, there's not direct instruction. They're learning on the job. But there does have to be monitoring to ensure that they are learning on the job and that they are progressing in the program. So there are cost factors for that. Adult general education, all programs right now are weighted the same. If it's a high school equivalency, or if it's adult basic ed, or if it's ESOL, they're all averaged out at the same cost factor level. Like the colleges, we also take into account the locally collected tuition revenue. So after we do all this workload, we calculate something called total workload funding need, and then we back out what is locally collected to arrive at what we call our state funding need calculation. We have added in the most recent years a few supplemental factors that the committee determined were not really being captured on an FTE basis. And I'll talk about those in the next slide. In terms of the weighted FTE that we use only actual FTE. Unlike the K-12 system that projects FTE, or the colleges that have an estimating process, we've determined that the best way that we could have an accurate model was to use actual FTE. There's a lot of reasons for this. I'll give you one example of why it's very hard to project or estimate our FTE, is that many of our programs allow students to come in the middle of the term. You know, it's not a managed enrollment system in every case. And without managed enrollment, it really becomes difficult to project where your target for the year is going to be. And so rather than run a funding model on something that is not a good estimate, we chose to use actual FTE. And like the colleges in their workload model, we use a 3-year average, although it's lagged 1 year back. So for the model that we're developing for 18-19, we would use the 14-15 through the 16-17 FTE. Similar to the colleges, we also do use the district cost differential. It is applied as it is in the K-12 formula. It is a direct multiplier against the state need. So if your district cost differential is above 1, your funding need goes up. If it's below 1, your funding need goes down. In terms of the supplemental factors that we have added recently, we do have a special program and statute authorized under 1004.935 that only affects 4 counties. So we put an adjustment in the model for that specific program for those 4 counties. We also have a high school equivalency testing center adjustment for those districts that run high school equivalency testing. The testing fee that they receive does not cover the full cost, and they also provide this service to the community beyond the students that are directly enrolled in adult ed. So we have an offset for those services. And we recently added a cost factor for services for students with disabilities. Similar to any other system, we are required to provide services for students with disabilities. And some of them may not have an external funding source, and the institution is obligated to provide that. So we developed, with the consultation of some disabilities experts, a matrix. And if the districts use this matrix, then we apply some moderate cost factors to the model. But I talk about these supplemental factors. They really don't generate the bulk of this model. I think if you added them all up, you're looking at maybe $2 million. The vast majority of it is being driven by the FTE. We also have a minimum funding level adjustment for our very small counties who may not generate a lot of FTE. They may have 50 students, 30 students, and they don't generate a minimum amount. This was a recommendation of OPAGA that we set a minimum amount for them, because if I serve 10 students or 40 students, I still have to have a teacher. I still have to have an infrastructure. So there are districts that benefit from that minimum funding because they are small rural districts that do not have a large population to serve. So in terms of how this gets operationalized, it's really just multiplication and subtraction for the most part. In addition, we apply to each of our 3-year average of the weighted FTE at the program, that cost factor to arrive at the weighted FTE. We have a standard cost factor per FTE that we use. We actually tie that to the K-12 base student allocation because that is kind of pegged to some standard costs that cover all of the things that our programs have to cover as well. We apply the district cost differential, and we subtract the tuition revenue. And that really gets at the workload need, and then those supplemental factors are added on, and again, don't generate a lot. In terms of how we use this model, which I think is what you guys are probably the most interested in, is we use an annual allocation process similar to the colleges. We know where the district is, and we know where this model says they need to be. And on an annual basis, the legislature has used this model to make adjustments. And it could be down. There could be a reduction in funds that are proposed by this model. Not all of our institutions currently have an appropriation that exceeds their workload need. So there are institutions that perhaps historically have seen declines of enrollment or a decline in need for services locally, and as a result, they may receive a recommendation for reduction through that allocation process. For reference, I'll just tell you what was used last year. I can't say that it's the same every year, but there are a few general policies that have been applied. If there are new resources available to put into the model, those get generated by the districts whose appropriation is not currently meeting their workload need as calculated by the model. There have also been downward adjustments to districts who were above the model, so to speak. So if they were at a certain amount above the model, they would receive a reduction. So for example, last year, any district, when we did this calculation, that was 115%, their state funding need was, or their current appropriation was 115% of their state funding need, they received a reduction during that allocation process. And then there might be additional allocations to districts below that. But the goal was to raise the floor for everybody, to get everybody as close to 100% of their state funding need as possible within the resource allocations that we have. This year, in 2017-18, our system did not have a performance funding allocation, so I've not prepared anything to discuss that. But this right now is the primary funding source for our operating funds for the districts, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Members, questions? Representative Edwards?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation. At the core of it, for me, is the adult literacy function to help move individuals into either the apprenticeship program, certificate, or other types of educational streams. Went back and looked at the last survey that was done. So around 2009, we figured that there was roughly 20% of our population here in Florida, those individuals that were 16 years old and older, that lacked just basic reading skills, right? And we haven't had an update to that survey since then. I'm very interested to know what we've done 2010 on to deal with that illiteracy crisis with those 2.6 million Floridians, how that's been funded, how we're working with the school districts, the workforce training programs, even libraries to help get those numbers down for the next survey coming up.
You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's one of the reasons why these programs exist, is to make that progression. Since 2009, the department has had some statutory changes that were implemented, as well as a programmatic philosophy change that I think moves us in the direction that you are talking about. The entirety of all of our adult education students, if you were reading at the 2nd grade level or you're reading at the 9th grade level and you're prepared for high school equivalency, the goal is to move you towards a career. And so every student who comes into our adult ed program is receiving that type of additional services to move them in that direction. Now, everybody's at a different place in the continuum. If you're at the 2nd grade level, there's a lot farther to move you. But everything is about a pathway. Our entire programs are designed as pathways. The new Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act is designed as a pathway. So all of our accountability structures are set up to move students along that pathway. I will say that our programs struggle because it is sometimes, life does get in the way for many of the students at the lower functioning levels. If you don't have your car for 2 weeks for some reason, or transportation or childcare, you're unable to access these programs for a period of time, and our programs have to deal with that level of instability. But that pathway is absolutely core to our mission. We can certainly look and see on metrics, if we have something more recent that we can share with you to see how we're doing. Florida has been moving in the right direction in terms of students who do not have a high school diploma. When we analyze the data regularly, because the allocations of our federal funds are based on local needs, so we have to pull all that data, the American Community Survey, on a regular basis. I've seen that number declining for our younger students. We still, if you look at 16 and over, you have a lot of people 55 and 65 who are less likely to access our services, who do in general pull the average down. But we have made some gains in recent years in the core of our population, which is primarily 16 to 44 are the students that we enroll in our programs. But I'd be happy to research some outcome-based things that would be informative for you on that.
If you would, that'd be great. Representative Mariano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for being here today. I just had one question. It's more of a request. If we could get the data, either county by county or district, however you have it, on the apprenticeship versus certificate routes and what those numbers look like at a more local level, that would be great. Thank you.
Yep. Our staff will get with you on that. So, questions? Representative Cortez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You had mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned Seminole County and Duval as having Seminole State handle the workforce. Is there a particular reason why, or is that just personal choice of the district?
Recognized?
Well, I've only been in the system 12 years, so these patterns predate my involvement. However, my understanding is that there are long-standing arrangements. There have been shifts where communities get together and they decide, we would like you to do this, and we're going to do that. I believe in those two particular counties, it was a long-standing arrangement that goes back many, many years, where that arrangement just remained because the service was being provided already by the college.
Maybe we'll ask them directly and get you an answer on that. Further questions? All right. Oh, Representative Leake for a question.
Thank you. My question really has to do with how nimble the system is. So if we are anticipating an influx of a population within a geographic area that may require English as a second language, how nimble is it? How quickly can we deal with that on the fly?
You're recognized.
Our providers actually do a really good job in their communities of anticipating those trends. The funding always lags that. I mean, that's just the reality of the funding system that we have. So what they have to do is they have to use those resources to the best of their abilities locally. They're going to pull on community resources if there's a particular need. Sometimes if it is, a hurricane-related kind of activity, what they will do is they'll work to get these students in. If they're homeless, they're going to qualify for the homeless exemption, so they'll be able to enroll them into their existing programs. If there are shifts in geography of where the programs are needed, they are paying attention to those trends locally. But the funding, unfortunately, will always lag, so they're going to reach out for the local resources that they have, and their communities are generally very supportive of helping them either access facilities if they don't have sufficient facilities, and working with them. All of our school districts, our large school districts in particular, they're out in the community. They're programs that are going to be in the libraries, they're going to be affiliated with local nonprofit organizations. They have sub-arrangements with those nonprofits for the federal grants, for example. So they're utilizing everything that they can in their region to help meet those needs when they change suddenly.
And I think Representative Cortez, did you tell me something about the already some of the English as a second language, or there were some programs already being put out? If you can share that with the committee.
Yeah, well, we were discussing, Mr. Chairman, thank you, on the issue on Puerto Rico and the many that have already come from Puerto Rico to Florida. The latest numbers were over 60,000. And one thing that we had started doing in Central Florida, because of the vast numbers that are coming, is to make sure that Valencia, Seminole State, and some of the other colleges were up front and in front of the potential crises by offering English classes in their colleges. And they stepped up big time by not only having what they already had, but increasing the frequency of these classes, and at a minimal cost of something like $30 for a 12-week intensive English course for these folks that are coming to Puerto Rico.
Thank you for that. Representative, Vice Chair Ponder for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be real quick. On the funding formula, we've got per student of $41.60 for 2017-18 model. And I was just trying to back into you got 360 million, 366 roughly last year, and I just by FTE round numbers, it's like 299, and so it's a little short. And so what's the difference? What makes up the difference?
You're recognized.
It's the program weights. So the FTE that I've shown you is unweighted. We weight the FTE so that electrical apprentice, for example, has a weight of 2,
okay,
so that 1 FTE becomes 2 FTE.
Thank you, Chairman.
Questions? Further questions? Seeing none, thank you for your presentation. Very good. Members.